The world map that hangs in schools is not wrong, but it is incomplete, not by omission of countries or borders, but by the quiet removal of shapes that once existed, marked and known. Shapes that appeared on maps for centuries, then vanished without explanation, no tectonic shift, no volcanic cataclysm, just absence. The kind of absence that leaves no scar, only a blank page where once there was memory, yet memory is persistent. And in cartography, memory does not vanish easily. If you believe this story is worth continuing, hit subscribe not just to follow, but to keep these unanswered questions alive. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1592, a Flemish navigator named Cornelis de Houtman returned from a voyage through the East Indies with a map that should not exist. It contained a detailed outline of a landmass west of Australia, shaped like a curled claw, with rivers that mirrored no known flow. He called it Terra Apis. The coordinates matched nothing modern, but here is the paradox: it also matched something older. A clay disk from Samaria, unearthed near Eridu, carried an identical curve etched in baked mud, annotated not with names, but with patterns. 6,000 years apart, yet the same outline. How could that be? The question is not why it was drawn, but why it was erased. By the 19th century, Terra Apis no longer appeared, not on British maritime charts, not on French atlases. When questioned, archivists gave no reason. Some even denied it ever appeared. But there were prints. In brittle archives of Portuguese monasteries, fading ink whispers of its curve. A line drawn and redrawn until it wasn't. This is not an isolated quirk. It is part of a wider forgetting, a forgetting with intention. Cartographers once operated not as technicians, but as custodians of memory. They encoded warnings into margins, etched anomalies into coastlines, a reef that moved, a bay that echoed, a shoreline visible only during a red moon. Such details were once treated with reverence. But as nation-states rose, maps became tools of control, not curiosity. Certainty replaced suspicion. The fog was removed not from the sea, but from the imagination. And yet, the old maps remain. In dusty drawers beneath maritime museums, in the faded pages of expedition diaries, in the stained walls of cliffside monasteries where monks once copied coastlines under candlelight, praying not to what they believed, but to what they feared. These maps do not beg to be believed. They wait, because those who drew them knew something modern charts refuse to accept. Not all coastlines are stable. Not all lands stay buried. In 1733, a shipwreck off the Azores revealed a sealed tube among the debris inside, a water-stained chart showing a chain of islands between Madeira and Bermuda, none of which exist today. The ship's manifest made no mention of it, but the captain's log ends abruptly. The final words read, "The edge is where the waves fall twice." No one knows what it means, but other captains have spoken of seas that seem to fold, of stars that do not move, yet pull the compass. The idea that maps could lie is disturbing, but more disturbing is the idea that they once told the truth and that truth was later removed. Consider the Dulcert map of 1339. At first glance, it resembles any medieval nautical chart, but along its western edge is a semicircular landform labeled Antillia. For over 200 years, Antillia appeared on maps across Europe, a refuge island, a remnant. Some believed it to be Atlantis under another name. Others believed it was a sanctuary of knowledge, unreachable except by storm. Then it disappeared, not because it was disproven, but because it was deemed unhelpful. The phrase comes from a letter dated 1508, written by an advisor to the Spanish crown. The island of Antillia, though frequently reported, serves no present maritime utility, and thus shall be excluded from future charts. Not disproven, not discredited, simply excluded. This exclusion did not happen once. It was repeated, map after map, chart after chart. Erasures passed like inheritance, until the memory was as fragile as parchment in salt air. Only a few dared resist. In a chapel in Girona, carved into a stone arch above the transept, is a depiction of a world map, not painted, but chiseled. The continents curve incorrectly. An ocean fills the center, and near the Atlantic, two islands face each other like twin eyes. One bears no name. The other bears a symbol, an open eye within a circle. The carving predates Columbus by over a century. No records explain its origin. The clergy refer to it only as the misplaced vault. Why do these old maps show what we're told never existed? Why were certain coastlines drawn and redrawn with confidence, then excised silently from every curriculum? What if the maps that linger in forgotten drawers are not inaccurate, but forbidden? Not false, but premature? What if the earth has a memory of its own, and it once surfaced only to be buried again by design? The fog, it seems, was never truly on the sea. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, the map in question was composed not from imagination, but from fragments older charts, sailor testimonies, and something else never fully disclosed. At first glance, it appears to be a conventional depiction of the Atlantic coastline. But one region breaks the pattern. At the map's southern edge lies a detailed outline of a continent that should not be there. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it should have been buried under ice for thousands of years. And yet, it is not drawn as ice. It is rendered with bays, rivers, and mountains, features no one in the 16th century should have known existed beneath the frozen sheet of Antarctica. Piri Reis himself confessed that he used 20 older sources to create his map, some of which, he claimed, dated back to the time of Alexander. Others, he described more vaguely, referring to them as charts no longer spoken of. Modern cartographers have examined the southern portion with disbelief. The coastline drawn on his vellum map aligns with seismic scans conducted in the 20th century scans which revealed the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, a region lost beneath over a mile of ice. But Piri Reis drew it ice-free. He should not have been able to. He should not have known it was even land. The anomaly cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The accuracy of that southern segment, down to its curvature and proportional scale, is too precise to be guessed. Nor does it match the southern coast of South America, as once assumed. When the United States Air Force analyzed the map in the 1960s, the conclusions were carefully worded. One internal memorandum remarked, "The geographical detail suggests an origin unknown to modern cartographic knowledge." They did not say forgery. They did not say myth. They said unknown. The ink used in the southern edge also tells an odd story. Under ultraviolet light, it fluoresces faintly green, unlike the rest of the map which glows a dull brown. The chemical signature, though composed from organic dyes, contains trace elements not native to the region of its creation. Some suspect the vellum itself may be older than the map recycled from an earlier chart now lost. A memory. Overwritten. What kind of source material would have allowed such precision? Where could these fragments have come from? Piri Reis was not alone eccentric. He was a military commander under Suleiman the Magnificent, with access to libraries captured from Alexandria, Rhodes, and Byzantium. After each conquest, maps were taken not destroyed, not burned, but absorbed, preserved selectively, catalogued in ways that made them inaccessible even to scholars. From these caches, he built his world, but a strange note lingers. In his own commentary on the map, Piri writes, "This section shows the coast as it was in ancient times, before it was covered by ice." This sentence has long been dismissed as poetic license. Yet, when viewed alongside geological evidence suggesting that parts of Antarctica may have been ice-free as recently as 6,000 years ago, it stops being merely poetic. Glaciologists have argued over this point for decades. While mainstream consensus holds that the Antarctic ice sheet is millions of years old, recent core samples show anomalies, sediment layers containing pollen, freshwater diatoms, and volcanic ash that do not align with the expected timeline. They suggest a period of warmth, brief and difficult to explain, and they match, faintly, the outlines on Piri's map. Still, institutions have resisted the implication. If Antarctica was known and mapped in detail before the last ice age fully descended, then someone must have been there. Someone capable not only of observing, but recording. And not on myth or legend, but on coordinate, on curvature, on scale. This is where the silence deepens. The portion of the map showing the frozen south is bordered by decorative script, Ottoman flourishes, floral designs, and along the lower right edge, a symbol not seen on any other Turkish map of the period. A circular motif with 7 inward spirals, centered around a dot. It is neither Arabic nor Ottoman. It resembles instead the spiral markings found carved into dolmens in Ireland and on basalt pillars near Lake Tana in Ethiopia, a symbol of return, of center, of memory coiled. Who placed it there and why? The same motif appears barely visible on another artifact kept in a locked drawer beneath the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a copper astrolabe etched with stars that do not match our current skies. The instrument was never catalogued formally, but a visiting scholar from Prague in 1887 noted in his diary, it charts a firmament known only to the deep past, or to the future returned. The possibility that ancient navigators mapped Antarctica before it was entombed raises a deeper riddle. Not how they could have, but why we are told they didn't. Across the centuries, knowledge has not simply been lost, it has been edited. The kind of editing that leaves no rough edge, just absence, smoothed by consensus. And maps are the perfect vessel for such erasure. They carry authority not through narrative, but through line and space. When a coast is removed, it is not questioned, it is forgotten. And perhaps that is why the southern curve of the Piri Reis map remains so unsettling. Not because it is obviously false, but because it is plausibly true, too plausible for comfort. What if there was once a time when Antarctica was known not as a dead, white continent, but as a green land-forested, fertile, sacred? What if it held not just land, but memory? What if the maps remembered when the world chose to forget? In 1986, off the southern coast of Yonaguni, a diver searching for hammerhead sharks instead found a staircase. It was carved not by chance or erosion, but by design cut into stone with angles too precise to be natural. As more of the structure was uncovered, what emerged did not resemble a temple or tomb. It resembled a map. One not drawn on parchment or vellum, but sculpted into the earth itself, platforms, terraces, and trenches aligned not with the island's topography, but with stars. Not with current coastlines, but with submerged ones. Beneath the waves, geography became memory. Geologists have debated the Yonaguni monument for decades. Some argue it is a natural formation, a rare product of tectonic uplift and fracturing. Others, including several marine archaeologists, point to the symmetry, the internal chambers, and the vertical shafts that mirror ceremonial spaces found in ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats. One set of grooves matches the Pleiades alignment during the spring equinox 9600 BCE, a date considered absurd by standard timelines, yet the data remains. This is not the only place where coordinates and stone collide beneath the ocean. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar scans have revealed rectilinear structures buried under silt, over 600 meters below the surface. Cuban and Canadian researchers documented paved platforms, perpendicular walls, and pyramid-like forms. What unsettled them most, however, were the markings' strange geometric patterns etched into the surfaces, forming what appeared to be an orientation grid. One diver described it not as a city, but a compass no longer pointing north. These underwater formations do not appear randomly. They cluster along submerged continental shelves regions that would have been dry during the last glacial maximum. When sea levels were over 100 meters lower, these were coastlines. Settled, walked upon, perhaps even mapped. But when the meltwaters rose, these edges vanished beneath oceans, and with them, the memory of what stood there. Except memory has a tendency to linger, not just in story, but in stone. At Dwarka, on the western coast of India, divers found an ancient port city submerged beneath the Gulf of Kambat. Stone anchors, walls, and grid-like streets emerged from the mud too deeply buried for medieval origin. One diver, surveying a flat platform beneath layers of coral, found something else. A set of inlaid circles, each touching the next, etched in descending order of size. It was not a decoration, it was a calibration. When compared with older Indian cosmological diagrams, it matched the layout of nakshatra ancient lunar mansions used in Vedic astronomy. But this alignment only made sense from a latitude now beneath the sea. The implication is unsettling. That navigation once began not with stars, but with the shape of the land itself. If one were to overlay the locations of these submerged formations, Yonaguni, Dwarka, Bimini Road, and the Cuban terraces, a strange pattern emerges. Not a triangle, as popular imagination suggests, but an arc. A slow, sweeping curve that mirrors the movement of the equinox over millennia. An echo, not just of space, but of time. This arc bends toward the Caribbean, where another anomaly lingers. Off the coast of Andros Island in the Bahamas, divers discovered what appears to be a wide causeway, a paved stone path that extends straight into the deep. The stones are fitted tightly, with beveled edges and a consistent gradient, as if designed for something massive, something weighted. At its end lies a circular depression, smooth, shallow, rimmed with triangular carvings pointing outward like a compass rose. Local fishermen call it La Boca Silenciosa, the silent mouth. They avoid it. What connects these places is not architectural style or cultural origin, but orientation. Each site, despite their scattered locations and depths, is oriented toward solstices or equinoxes. Some face magnetic anomalies, others point toward now-vanished stars. This suggests not randomness, but intention. A system of memory encoded in coordinates, buried beneath the tides. If these are maps, then they are not of territory but of resonance. Not places to be found, but places to be felt. What kind of civilization would have etched their charts into the earth itself? Why choose stone, sea, and silence as vessels for knowledge? Perhaps because they knew paper burns. Ink fades, but bedrock remains. a coral-covered stairway in Yonaguni, a concentric grid in the Gulf of Kambat, a compass without north near Cuba. These are not structures. They are sentences, written in the grammar of alignment and carved in the language of the earth. Mainstream historians resist these ideas. Rightfully cautious, they warn against seeing patterns where none exist. But that caution can itself become a blindness. When confronted with evidence that does not fit the framework is often preserved not by explanation, but by exclusion. The problem is not that these sites exist. The problem is that they align. What if someone long ago mapped not continents, but consciousness, not geography, but geometry? What if these submerged patterns are not ruins at all, but reminders, fragments of a cartography too old to name, too vast to classify? And what if the ocean, in its shifting tides and rising salt, is not erasing the past, but revealing it one submerged corner at a time? In 1737, a French mapmaker named Philippe Boitier presented a chart to the Royal Academy of Sciences. It depicted a peculiar landmass positioned squarely in the North Atlantic, northwest of Cuba, and east of the Yucatan. He labeled it simply as Île Inconnue, the unknown island. Though drawn with confidence and clarity, its existence has since been dismissed. No such land appears on modern maps. Satellites show nothing but sea. Yet Boitier's island was not drawn in isolation. It matched almost exactly a shadowy feature visible on earlier Spanish navigation charts, known to Portuguese sailors as Ilha das Sombras, the island of shadows. These references, scattered across centuries, describe a place that emerged during low tide and vanished under certain moons. They note strange behavior in the compass needle. They record sightings of seabirds circling where no land should be. And they always speak of silence of waves calming in its presence, of wind failing to reach it. Boitier's chart was specific. He gave coordinates, not vague impressions, but precise placement. He based his drawing on maritime logs collected from French and Dutch vessels returning from the West Indies. Most had never seen the island themselves, but many reported currents that curved inexplicably, storms that broke against unseen shores, and sudden rises in seafloor depth inconsistent with known bathymetry. For a time, the island remained a fixture of navigation, not because it was proven, but because it was feared. Captains altered routes to avoid it. A few claimed to see a flicker of green above the horizon before fog consumed the space, and then, without ceremony or correction, it disappeared not from the ocean, but from the maps. The British Admiralty omitted it first. By 1785, French naval charts followed. Later atlases would make no mention of it. No note, no retraction, just absence. Yet the seafloor remembers. In 2001, a submarine survey conducted during fiber optic cable installation detected an anomalous elevation at nearly the same coordinates Boitier had drawn. Not a mountain, a shelf, flat, wide, no longer breaking the surface, but still present 300 feet beneath the waves. The structure was unusual. Its outline traced a crescent, and along its edge were ridges spaced with unsettling precision. Not random, not natural. Measured. A team of oceanographers mapped the shelf using side-scan sonar. When rendered digitally, the terrain resembled a sunken acropolis. Terraces. Angled descents. A trench at the center, circular and steep. They named the site Anomaly 73, citing no connection to Boitier's map. But privately, two of the researchers noted in internal logs the resemblance to a city-like imprint, distorted by time and weight. Official reports labeled the structure geological. But the internal memos told another story, one not of certainty, but of confusion. One diver wrote, "The shapes are wrong, too straight, too intentional. It's as if the sea swallowed a blueprint. If Boache's island truly existed, then its removal from history was not caused by nature, but by narrative. A decision made not by wave or erosion, but by consensus. And consensus, in the world of maps, is rarely neutral. When an island vanishes from the charts, it is not just land that is erased, it is meaning, it is memory. The choice to redraw the sea without its presence implies more than correction, it suggests instruction. A message that says, forget. But forgetting leaves traces. In the margins of old naval almanacs, in the annotations of surviving logbooks, in the stories whispered by coastal families in the Bahamas who speak of a green edge that fishermen once saw at dusk, an emerald line that shimmered before the world turned blue again. Even stranger are the acoustic anomalies. In 2014, a research vessel mapping whale migration patterns near the same region recorded low-frequency sounds echoing from the ocean floor. Not whale song, not tectonic movement. A rhythm, intermittent, subtle, repeating. When plotted as a waveform, it formed a spiral not unlike the ancient glyphs found carved into dolmens across Europe. What if the island was never a myth, but a memory suppressed? What if it did not sink from erosion, but from something older, something deliberate? Perhaps it was not land in the conventional sense, but a threshold. A hinge point between surface and depth, between what is shown and what is hidden. There is an ancient term used by seafarers in the Canary Islands Marcolado. It describes a place in the water where currents cancel each other, and sound refuses to travel. Sailors avoid these spots, not because they are dangerous, but because they are too still. One such Marcolado was said to lie east of Cuba, precisely where Boache placed his unknown island. What does it mean when silence reoccurs at the same coordinates, when different cultures, centuries apart, mark the same point on the map as forbidden, uncharted, or erased? Perhaps maps do not just reflect our world, but shape what we are allowed to remember of it. And if that is true, what other coordinates are missing? What other islands were drawn not in myth, but in warning? They disappeared without noise, without battle, without fire. A quiet vanishing marked not by death, but by absence. Cartographers whose names once adorned royal documents, naval expeditions, and celestial charts simply ceased to sign anything. Their seals faded from parchment, their glyphs went unsigned, their instruments left behind in drawers now sealed by dust. From Venice to Alexandria, from Prague to Lisbon, the pattern repeated over generations. Those who drew the world too precisely, those who charted what should not have been known, were removed not with accusation, but with erasure. In 1681, a Venetian mapmaker named Giacomo Bellini submitted a folio to the Doge's court. It included a new rendering of the Adriatic coast, unremarkable at first glance. But folded within the binding was an insert, an atlas sheet annotated in gold leaf. It showed no cities, no kingdoms, only lines. Lines that crossed beneath known topography. Arcs that did not match rivers or trade routes, but resonated with something else entirely. Bellini labeled them the lays of the vault. Within a week, he vanished. His workshop was seized. His apprentices questioned. The insert disappeared. No record of the sheet remains, except a reference in the court scribe's journal, map withdrawn on order. Two aligned for comfort. In Lisbon, a similar disappearance occurred in 1719. João de Moura. a cartographer for the Royal Navy, was commissioned to produce an updated chart of the Azores. The map he returned included a strange overlay dotted lines forming a 9-pointed spiral, centered not on land, but on sea. Each point corresponded to documented shipwrecks over a 100-year period. João was dismissed, then exiled, but in his private notes, discovered years later inside a hollowed compass, he wrote, "The pattern does not predict disaster. It marks recurrence." The question becomes who determined what was too aligned, too revealing, who enforced the unmapping. Many of the missing cartographers had connections to ecclesiastical bodies. Some were trained in monastic scriptoria. Others worked in cathedral towers, measuring stars for calendars now defunct. They understood time, not as chronology, but as orientation. They did not map borders. They mapped cycles, and that may have been the problem. In Prague, during the winter of 1742, a manuscript surfaced in the cellar of a Jesuit observatory. It contained a map unlike any known design circular, nested, with continents arranged around a darkened core labeled mutatio. No compass rose, no scale. Only concentric bands marked with lunar phases and eclipses. The margins were filled with symbols later identified as variations of Enochian script, an angelic alphabet whispered about but never formally adopted. The map was never published. The priest who found it died of exposure 2 days after reporting it, his body discovered in the courtyard, barefoot, hands ink-stained, eyes open to the snow. The map has not resurfaced, but fragments of it remain scans hidden in restricted university archives, traced by amateur researchers who notice that the arrangement of its landmasses matches not modern geography, but submerged tectonic lines beneath the Atlantic. Not the world as it is, but the world before its current shape, the world before the cataclysm. What connects these vanished cartographers is not a school or a guild, but an insight and unwillingness to obey the boundaries of sanctioned geography. They mapped recurrence. They aligned myth with measurement. They treated ancient floods, fallen stars, and broken coastlines as data, not folklore, and for that they were silenced. Their tools, however, remain. In the vaults of forgotten libraries, their compasses lie with reversed polarities. Their armillary spheres display tilt angles not found in current Earth orientation. One sphere, preserved in Milan, rotates along an axis tilted 30 degrees from Earth's present ecliptic. When aligned with it, the continents of a precession cycle 24,000 years ago snap into unexpected harmony. Shorelines that today lie buried match rings engraved on the bronze surface. It does not prove a lost civilization, but it suggests a remembered alignment. In Egypt, beneath layers of modern Cairo, excavations in 1923 revealed a tiled chamber filled with broken slate tablets. Each bore grid lines. Some included arcs. When reconstructed, they resembled partial maps but without recognizable continents. What was present, however, were reference points nodes, vortices, labeled not in coordinates, but in tones. One tile read 4th breath, rising pitch, 7th mark. The chamber had no writing, only resonance. Perhaps these early cartographers were not merely trying to represent space, but to preserve pattern. Perhaps they believed the world had memory one stored not in ink, but in vibration. And perhaps they knew that to reveal such memory risked its removal. Official history labels them as outliers, fringe thinkers, mystics with compasses. Yet across centuries and cultures, their works share similarities that cannot be coincidence. Spirals, harmonic nodes, inverted hemispheres, coastlines before the melt, time mapped in loops, not lines. What if the ones who vanished did not fail, but succeeded too deeply? What if they reached the floor beneath the floor? The layer of truth wrapped in silence. And if so, what kind of world requires their disappearance for its current form to hold? In 1891, a globe surfaced in a cellar beneath the old town of Prague, carved from brass and bone, with no maker's mark, no inscriptions, and no axis to hold it in spin. The object was smooth, faintly iridescent under firelight, and its geography bore only passing resemblance to our known world. Continents were present, but displaced, angled, stretched, rotated. Oceans were darker, narrower. A ring of land surrounded the South Pole, and, strangest of all, it appeared to show the Earth not from a human perspective, but from above, far above, as if seen from orbit. At the time, it was considered a hoax, a curiosity made by an eccentric artisan. But the craftsmanship suggested otherwise. No seams, no welds, and no tool marks. The continents had depth, engraved with tiny etchings of rivers that flowed along paths not visible to the naked eye, but revealed under magnification. One observer described the globe as not a model of our Earth, but of another version of it, remembered from a vantage we no longer occupy. Stored for decades in a university archive, the object went unstudied until 1962, when a physicist examining old artifacts for geometric anomalies took notice. His report was never published, but the surviving notes mention something unsettling. When illuminated from a particular angle, the globe cast a shadow against the wall that formed a spiral. Not random, but Fibonacci precise, geometric, perfect. The light had to strike from above, mimicking the sun's angle during the equinox. He wrote only one more line before his notebook ended. This is not a globe. It is a key. That same spiral appears elsewhere. On the floor of a cathedral in southern Spain, carved into black basalt at the crossing between nave and transept, invisible unless seen from above. On a bone plate unearthed in a burial mound near Lake Baikal. On the wrist of a mummified child in the Andes, tattooed in fading ink and wrapped in copper thread, always the same proportions, always hidden in plain sight. The implication is not just that someone once had a different view of the Earth, but that they encoded it in form, not as myth, as memory. Passed on not through books, but through shapes, patterns, ratios, through tools mistaken for ornaments. In 1937, a German linguist visiting a Coptic monastery in Egypt was allowed into a locked storeroom beneath the chapel floor. There, among scrolls and broken altar stones, he found fragments of a sphere, not a full globe, but a segment, etched with star patterns unfamiliar to any chart in known astronomy. It showed the Earth beneath the stars, yes, but not in current alignment. The heavens were tilted, the pole star absent, and a dark circle marked the center. No names, only orbits. When he traced the lines by hand and compared them to stellar precession charts, one match emerged 12,000 years ago. That would place the globe's design deep into the Ice Age, a time when, officially, no maps existed, no globes, no knowledge of the sky beyond seasonal superstition. And yet the carving was there, hard, deliberate, older than the chapel that buried it. When he reported the find, he was quietly removed from the monastery and forbidden re-entry. No official explanation followed. The fragment vanished, but not the copy he had traced on vellum. His drawing survives in a private collection in Zurich, smuggled during wartime transit. The contours are strange, off-center, but when overlaid on a topographic model of the Earth's magnetic field, something clicks. The old sphere did not depict continents by landmass. It showed them by resonance, high and low harmonic zones, where sound and gravity intersect. Not geography. Geometry. The same alignment found in Gothic cathedral acoustics. The same used in the layout of Stonehenge and the pyramids of Saqqara. The same that defines certain forbidden coordinates no longer used in modern mapping. This brings us to the maps that are not maps those constructed from metal, stone, and rhythm, devices mistaken for ritual, but whose function was orientation, not to north or star, but to something deeper. Beneath the Vatican lies a cartography chamber few speak of, not listed in visitor records, not photographed. Those who have entered describe it not as a library, but as a vault. Thousands of scrolls, layered like strata, each one a variation of the world, some familiar, others unrecognizable. One in particular, said to be drawn in reverse ink, shows a mirror Earth, continents flipped, oceans shallow. The date, 1039 BCE. The source, unknown. Why preserve maps that contradict all others? Why hold globes that show coastlines no longer visible? Perhaps because they were never meant to guide ships but minds. One scroll, whispered about by archivists, allegedly charts a migration not of people, but of memory. It begins not with a coastline, but with a symbol, the spiral, followed by a series of concentric lines and broken arcs that lead to what is labeled simply Vault 0. No location, no latitude, only an instruction. Only when seen from the sky shall the path unlock. If true, then the maps we've been shown are fragments, not foundation, training tools, not totalities, designed to prepare, not to preserve, and what they prepare us for is not navigation, but return. What if the earliest globes were not objects of knowledge, but devices of recall? What if they encoded how to see not with the eyes, but with orientation? And what if the reason they were hidden, sealed, or forgotten was not because they failed, but because they worked? When explorers first reached the Greenland interior in the early 1800s, they found only silence, ice, wind, and the crushing weight of distance. No ruins, no monuments, no evidence of civilization. And yet, earlier maps from the Middle Ages depicted something else entirely. They showed rivers flowing across its surface, deltas branching into inland basins, and even forests labeled with Norse runes. These maps were not crude, they were deliberate, etched with contour lines and navigational notes. Today, they are considered mistaken. But what if they were not the oldest of these charts? A Norse parchment from 1427, now housed in Copenhagen, shows 3 rivers flowing northward from what is now the glacial heart. The rivers are named, their courses precise, with notations marking eddies, fish abundance, and seasonal ice retreats. Beneath the ink, faint carbon scoring suggests it was traced from an older sheet, long lost. Some scholars argue that the rivers are artistic flourishes, imagined tributaries for mythic journeys. Others note that glacial radar from the mid-1990s discovered deep sub-ice channels rivers that had once flowed freely beneath the land, matching the map's alignment too closely to dismiss. This contradiction raises a question few dare to speak aloud. How could a 15th-century sailor know the structure of land buried beneath a mile of ice? One answer lies in a forgotten discipline, glaciocartography. Not the modern science of mapping glaciers, but the ancient art of reading ice through sound and light. Inuit elders in remote Greenland communities have long spoken of songs that echo differently over frozen terrain, of drumbeats that reveal hollows beneath the snow. Their chants align with valleys unseen, their migrations mapped not by star or sun, but by tone. These are not legends. They are instructions. And they match, eerily, with the lines traced centuries earlier on those forbidden maps. In 1932, during the International Polar Year, a Soviet team stationed near the Greenland ice sheet reported strange readings. One instrument, meant to track gravitational variation, registered rhythmic pulses beneath the ice low, slow, spaced evenly apart. At first assumed to be mechanical interference, the signal remained consistent over months, strongest in the area where the old maps placed lakes. A later expedition attempted ground penetration radar, but the equipment failed. No cause was determined. The site was labeled anomalous, and the data archived without further study, and yet local fishermen still tell of warm spots, pockets in the ice where mist rises even in deepest winter, where compasses fail and dogs refuse to approach. These zones coincide with where ancient maps marked settlements. Not cities, but outposts. Observation points. Places not built for living, but for remembering. Further south, a medieval Islamic map discovered in Fez shows Greenland not as a land of snow, but of stone. Its western coast is drawn jagged, carved into fjords with Arabic script labeling each bay. One bay is called Madkhal al-Saut, the gateway of sound. When the map was translated in the 1930s, scholars assumed it referred to wind, but the word used denotes not breeze, but intonation, the kind used in reciting sacred verses. Why name a coastline after sound unless it answered back? Geological surveys in the area have indeed identified a series of fault lines that, when struck by seismic waves, produce harmonic resonance. One study recorded tones within the human audible range, lasting up to 90 seconds. Not noise, not random. Chords. Perhaps these lands were not inhabited in the traditional sense. Perhaps they were not homesteads, but instruments. Tuned not for survival, but for orientation. If so, then the maps were not for travel. They were for recall. There is another clue, tucked inside a 17th century seaman's almanac recovered from a sunken Dutch vessel. Among tide tables and constellation charts is a folded insert, a square of linen etched with blue dye, worn at the corners. It depicts Greenland not from above, but from below. Not its surface, but its cross-section, as if sliced. Layers of stone, ice, and beneath them, a hollow, oval-shaped, marked only with a glyph resembling a tuning fork. Modern scans of the ice sheet have identified an unexplained void near Summit Station, an oval cavity over 2 kilometers across, filled not with ice, but with compressed air and sediment. Its origin remains unknown. Too symmetrical for natural erosion, too stable for collapse. Its presence aligns with the linen chart down to the curvature. Once again, the impossible map proves accurate, and the official record grows silent. Governments no longer address these anomalies. The scientific reports are unpublicized, the instruments moved, the funding withdrawn. Silence follows the evidence like mist on a thawing river, but the old maps persist in archives, in private collections, in the margins of discredited papers. They whisper of a Greenland that once breathed, once echoed, once mapped not with conquest, but with listening, and perhaps, beneath the ice, that memory still sings. What if Greenland was not a frozen void, but a preserved chord in the Earth's long-forgotten melody? What if its rivers did flow, its stones did speak, and those who first mapped it knew that memory, when buried under ice, does not die, but deepens? In the heart of Cairo's Islamic quarter, inside a small and unassuming manuscript vault behind Al-Azhar Mosque, lies a collection of maps that scholars rarely cite. They were bound in goat leather, written in Kufic script and annotated not in miles or leagues, but in rhythms. Each sheet bears a strange pattern, spirals etched into the margins, always rotating counterclockwise, always originating from a single point marked with a blackened dot. These are not decorative. When traced with a compass, the spirals align perfectly with cities across the ancient world: Persepolis, Byblos, Memphis, Carthage, even cities now gone, like Ubar and Tanis, fall along the spiral's unwinding path. The scribe who compiled the collection remains unknown. The manuscript contains no dates, no names, only a title rendered in gold, Tartib al-Sawt wal-Bait, the arrangement of sound and dwelling. A title that makes little sense to cartographers, but to those who studied ancient architecture, it opens a door. Because the same spiral pattern found on these maps also appears carved into the stone floors of temples in India, stamped into clay tablets in Sumer, and scratched into bone charms buried with shamans in Siberia. It is not a cultural motif. It is a memory. What does it mean when cultures that never touched each other use the same spatial rhythm? Why do their sacred sites fall upon a pattern not visible in terrain, but in tone? In 2007, an acoustic physicist running tests inside the ruined Temple of Nasdra in Malta discovered that the innermost chamber produced a distinct harmonic when a voice intoned a low chant at 110 hertz. The sound did not echo. It held. It shimmered. When plotted, the standing wave created a spiral concentric nodes forming a shape matching the pattern found in the Al-Azhar manuscript. The same frequency appears in the oracle chamber of the hypogeum at Hal Saflieni. When a man speaks at the right pitch, the chamber hums. Not loudly, but deeply, as though the walls themselves remember how to listen, and the spiral carved into the ceiling, barely visible, unless the light is angled just right, not decorative, directional. Some ancient builders understood space not just as shelter, but as resonance. They constructed in tune, not just in stone, and their maps, if one dares to call them that, reflect this. They are not tools for terrain, but diagrams of vibration, of how space feels when struck by presence. In Peru, the Quiro elders speak of Sonco, the spiral of the heart. In their cosmology, every sacred place has a pulse, a beat that aligns with the great breath of the earth. Pilgrims walk spiral paths up mountains, not to reach the summit, but to enter rhythm. Their textiles carry the spiral, their prayers repeat it, and their oldest stone circles mirror its unwinding. Western archaeologists dismissed these as coincidental, until satellite imaging revealed something else. Several ancient ceremonial paths once thought random actually trace logarithmic spirals when plotted by GPS. This includes pathways at Chavin de Huantar, the Serpent Mound in Ohio, and Nabta Playa in Egypt. Different continents, same curve, same invisible logic. Could it be that ancient civilizations encoded memory not in symbols, but in geometry, that they mapped time as shape? The spiral, unlike a line, does not begin or end. It folds back upon itself, deepening rather than concluding. And that is how many of these maps behave. They do not direct, they recall. They do not instruct. They awaken. In 1956, a monk copying damaged manuscripts in a Maronite monastery in Lebanon discovered a parchment that bore no recognizable writing. It was a map, of sorts circles nested within spirals, with faint dots positioned in precise intervals. When matched to the night sky, they formed no known constellation. But when layered over Earth's magnetic anomalies, the points fell into place. Each dot aligned with a known sacred site. The parchment, unsigned, was stored among apocryphal gospels, its significance never explored. But one scholar visiting the monastery noted that the spiral center was marked not with a place, but a phrase. Beit al-Sur, the house of secret. Perhaps the spirals were never meant to be decoded. Perhaps they were meant to be entered. Not physically, but resonantly. The Al-Azhar maps do not guide the eye. They disturb the body. Some who study them report headaches, nausea, even euphoria. One researcher compared the experience to standing inside a bell that had just been struck. Time blurs. Orientation shifts. The spiral is not static. It moves. And if it moves, then what does that say of the world it depicts? We are taught that maps reflect the fixed, the unmoving. But these maps suggest another truth, that space may be shaped by sound, and memory held not in stone, but in vibration. That the places we seek are not hidden by distance, but by frequency. And to find them, we must listen. What if the lost civilizations never vanished, but receded into harmonics no longer heard? What if their maps did not fade, but still sing quietly, patiently, waiting for someone to match their spiral breath? There is a stone in the Pergamon Museum that no guidebook mentions. It rests near the edge of a minor gallery, behind glass, unmarked by placard or translation. Visitors pass it without pause. To the untrained eye, it resembles any fragment of ruin, a dark, oval tablet worn smooth by time, with no writing, no carving, no hint of origin. Yet when acoustic tests were performed in the 1980s as part of a museum-wide resonance survey, the stone responded strangely. Unlike other artifacts, which absorbed or reflected sound, this one swallowed it. When struck with a tuning fork, even gently, it yielded no echo. The room fell dead quiet, as if all vibration ceased. The technicians labeled it anomalous and moved on. But one physicist, intrigued, returned at night. Using a low-frequency oscillator, he tested a sweep across the audible range. At precisely 56 hertz, the stone emitted a faint hum, not from its surface, but from within. The sound did not travel far. It seemed to coil inward, spiraling down like breath held beneath stone. He called it the soundless stone, and filed a private report. It was never published. Years later, a scholar of Aramaic visiting the museum on an unrelated project overheard staff discussing the stone. She requested to examine it, and upon close inspection noticed something odd along its underside, a narrow band of discoloration, forming a thin groove that wrapped in a perfect ellipse. Not decoration, not erosion, a channel. When filled with powdered chalk, a pattern emerged 12 notches, evenly spaced, not symbols, intervals. Elsewhere in the museum's storage archives, a Roman scroll references a stone of 12 silences, once housed in the library of Pergamon, said to be deaf to the trumpet, yet alive to breath. It was used, the scroll claims, in rituals of memory where initiates would speak not aloud, but inwardly, and receive echoes not in ear, but in thought. No other record confirms this rite. But the scroll matches the description of the object exactly. An oval stone, 12 divisions, a hollow within. In the margin, a phrase is underlined, memoria per tonum memory through tone. What kind of memory could live in silence? Theories abound. Some believe the stone is a resonance archive, a device engineered not to play sound, but to store its impression. Others suggest it is a container for linguistic structure itself, a blueprint for spoken pattern, older than language, older than script. A few go further, proposing that it was not made by human hands at all, but found exhumed from beneath Pergamon's foundations during the early construction of the library. There are precedents. In 1899, during the excavation of a collapsed vault near the Euphrates, archaeologists uncovered a basalt slab that mirrored the soundless stone in both shape and dimension. It, too, bore no inscription, but when cleaned revealed a series of faint concentric rings, almost imperceptible, like the echo of something once pressed and long since lifted. The rings matched those found in somatic pattern shapes formed by sound when it vibrates through a medium like sand or water. Not art, not ornament, but sonic imprint. Across cultures, across centuries. The idea of sound as a vessel of memory recurs. Tibetan bells tuned to brainwave frequencies. Aboriginal songlines mapping Australia's deserts. The zikr rituals of Sufi mystics, in which the repetition of divine names induces altered perception. These are not performances. They are realignments. The act of recalling not a story, but a state. And if sound can recall states, then what does silence recall? One medieval manuscript from Cordoba describes a stone that answers not with words, but with stillness deeper than thought. It claims that such stones were placed at the center of ancient gathering chambers, not as altars, but as anchors. Points where frequency collapses, where the spiral stops, where memory is not spoken, but returned. This idea reappears in Gnostic texts, where the tone of origin is described not as a sound one hears, but a stillness one recognizes, a cessation that marks the boundary between worlds. The soundless stone, then, may not be a relic of a civilization, but of a threshold, a device that holds the silence before creation. A pause encoded in matter. In 2015, a team of researchers secured limited access to the stone under the pretense of material testing. They used magnetometers, vibration transducers, and electromagnetic scans. The results were inconclusive, but one anomaly persisted: a faint EM field emanating from the stone's core, pulsing at intervals corresponding to lunar cycles. A pulse too weak to detect without prolonged monitoring, but consistent and timed. How could a silent stone know the moon? After the tests, access was revoked. The glass case returned. No public mention was made. But in private, the lead researcher wrote a final note. It is not a record. It is a resonance. Not what was said, but the shape of saying. What if ancient memory was not stored in writing, but in form? What if knowledge was not passed down through symbols, but through silence arranged into matter? And what if the things we call relics are not fragments of history, but instruments waiting to be struck? The soundless stone does not demand belief. It does not speak. It waits. And in its waiting, it asks a question not through language, but through absence. What if forgetting was never the loss of words, but the loss of tone? In the monastery archives of St. Minas, near Alexandria, a damaged inventory list survives. It is brief, written in hurried Greek script, and organized like any other scrolls, censers, vessels for oil and wine. But near the bottom, one line stands apart, crossed out in red, yet still visible beneath the ink. It reads a rod of truth, forbidden to name, warm to the hand, mute in shadow, awake in song. No other entry is annotated. No further explanation is given. It appears only once, then vanishes from all other records. Yet among certain esoteric circles, whispered references to this rod persist. They call it the Staff of Resonance. Though no official source uses the name, it is said to have surfaced in different centuries, in different lands, each time accompanied by unusual effects. In Ethiopia, It was described as a staff that hummed when held in silence. In Armenia, a relic said to induce speechlessness in liars. In a crypt beneath Ravenna, a carving shows a slender rod held by a figure without a mouth. The rod is striped alternating bands of light and dark, its tip a smooth sphere. In each depiction, it is never raised, never used in force. It rests, always, as if listening. What tool listens instead of speaks? In 1924, a Jesuit linguist studying pre-Coptic inscriptions in Upper Egypt encountered a wall painting nearly erased by time. Beneath layers of soot, it showed a man kneeling before a black column. Above his head were waves painted gold, unfurling in concentric arcs. He described it not as prayer, but as sonic offering. When his paper on the discovery was published, the illustration was omitted. No explanation was given. His original sketch disappeared from the university archive the following year, but the motif returns elsewhere. In the temple at Edfu, a recurring relief shows a long object carried not by kings or warriors, but by scribes. Its proportions remain the same: thin, shoulder height, tipped with a sphere. In each instance, it is held parallel to the ground. One scholar proposed it was a stylus, another, a scepter. But neither interpretation explains the markings engraved along its length waveforms, repeating, symmetrical, unlike any script. They resemble modern frequency graphs. In 1978, a musician studying ancient tuning systems noticed the pattern mirrored the harmonic series in a just intonation scale. Not an exact match, but close enough to suggest intent. The engravings were not words, they were sound. Sound made solid, formed not to be read, but resonated. A sealed letter from 1811 found among the effects of a defrocked bishop contains a curious confession. He speaks of an artifact taken from the desert monks, not understood, yet feared. He describes it as silent in light, but vibrant in darkness. He claims to have touched it once and felt a sensation not of heat, but of recognition. He was removed from his post within the year. The letter was never sent. In the decades since, scattered references to such an object have been catalogued, though always dismissed as allegory. Yet they converge on certain traits. The rod is not ornate. It emits no light, but in chambers of deep stillness, it hums. Not constantly, only when held with intention. The tone it emits is subtle, almost imperceptible, like breath drawn inward, like memory recalling itself. Some believe it was a key not for doors, but for people. That when held by certain individuals, it activated states of clarity, of alignment, of unburdened perception. Not magic, not miracle. Resonance, a matching of internal and external tone, like tuning a vessel until it no longer resists the current. There is reason to believe the rod was not singular, that it belonged to a set, perhaps 12, distributed across regions known for their acoustic precision. Malta, Armenia, Abydos, the monastery of St. Catherine. All places where voice carried strangely, where chant lingered longer than it should, where stone absorbed meaning. In the catacombs of Kom el Shokafa, a rarely visited chamber features a carving unlike any other. A man and woman kneel beside a tall object flanked by animal-headed figures. Above them hangs a symbol resembling an ear. No text, just the image. It is the only relief in the complex where the figures do not face the dead, they face the stone. One researcher, examining the chamber's acoustics in 2011, noted a phenomenon: certain tones produced standing waves that formed ellipses of silence. When measured, these ellipses centered on the carved rod. The room had been tuned, not to echo, but to cancel. A frequency gate, a resonance valve, and the rod, perhaps, the key to that silence. If this object existed, its nature challenges the very idea of knowledge transmission. It suggests memory not as a static record, but as a dynamic field, something accessed, not stored. Something awakened by harmony, not retrieved by logic. What if the rod was never a tool of power, but of permission? What if it granted access to a state where truth could be sensed directly without translation, without interpretation? And what if that state was once common, but has since been buried beneath layers of noise, of language, of forgetting? Why else would an artifact be erased so thoroughly, so precisely not destroyed, hidden, suppressed not by fire but by silence? And if it is still out there, resting beneath stone, humming beneath breath, who will find it next? No temple remains untouched by time, yet some do not simply decay, they vanish. Not by weather or war, but by design. Deep in the Jordanian desert, buried beneath a collapsed ridge of sandstone and salt, archaeologists once uncovered a circular platform cut with surgical precision into the bedrock. It bore no stairs, no entrance, no visible purpose, just a spiral groove etched into its center, winding inward like a fingerprint pressed into the earth. There were no offerings, no bones, no altar. But when a team member dropped a coin into the groove's center, the air trembled not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet shift, like a breath caught between walls. The phenomenon was noted, measured, then ignored. The site, unnamed and unclaimed, was sealed again under layers of dust and bureaucracy. Yet the spiral remained etched in memory. The same design appears halfway across the world in a ruined Mayan complex near Palenque. There, in a chamber sealed for centuries, archaeologists found a floor tile dislodged from a polished stone basin. Beneath it, another spiral groove, this time wider, deeper, cut not by tool but pressure. Along its edge, obsidian flakes shimmered like fossilized starlight. A low hum, imperceptible to the ear, registered faintly on seismic sensors. The team published no conclusions, only a diagram and a note unexplained harmonic resonance. From Malta to Peru, from Anatolia to Guatemala, spiral grooves appear where no road leads, no doctrine survives, always carved with care, always nested in silence. Some are shallow, barely a whisper on the stone. Others deep, as though expecting something to return. These are not decorative flourishes, they are functions. Ancient tools whose mechanisms lie not in moving parts, but in place, proportion, and pressure. Their dimensions mirror the logarithmic spiral found in nautilus shells, hurricanes, galaxies, a geometry of growth, of inward return. A memory pattern. Modern engineers have tried to recreate the effect. Some use stone, others metal, yet none can replicate the tonal behavior. When air moves over the original grooves under the right conditions, a harmonic emerges not like a whistle, but like a word held just out of reach, a vibration not heard but felt in the chest, as if the spiral was tuned not to the atmosphere, but to the body. Ancient texts are silent on these structures. They are rarely mentioned in myth, never codified in scripture, yet they persist. In Sufi architecture, in Tibetan mandalas, in the spiraled pilgrimage paths of medieval cathedrals, places where feet follow a curve not to reach a point, but to align a rhythm. A French architect studying labyrinthine floor plans in Chartres noticed that the center of the spiral always fell beneath the dome's acoustic node. When a monk chanted at that point, his voice echoed back upon itself in perfect phase, a sonic still point. The room did not amplify him, it joined him. The spiral beneath was not for movement, it was for resonance. Some believe these grooves were used in rituals of memory, not to remember stories, but to recall states of clarity, of silence, of presence. They were not altars. They were instruments, played not with hands, but with steps, breaths, tones. One chamber in southern Anatolia, recently unearthed and yet to be publicly announced, holds a spiral embedded in a sloped wall. The groove begins chest height and winds downward, as though meant to draw something not into the earth, but out of it. The room has no corners. Its walls curve inward, softening echo. When a low-frequency pulse was introduced, sensors picked up a standing wave held for 9 seconds longer than in open air. Not random, not coincidental, tuned, and always. These places align with stars, with solstices, with underground aquifers that hum under magnetic fluctuation. The spiral, it seems, is not just a shape. It is a map, a guide not through land, but through tone, a means of return to something older than language. No modern theology accounts for this. No curriculum teaches it. These grooves are anomalies, dismissed as ceremonial or decorative. But the silence around them speaks louder than theory. It suggests exclusion, a deliberate forgetting. As if someone, somewhere, decided these spaces could no longer be named. What if memory was once spatial, not semantic? What if it lived in curves, not characters? What if to forget the spiral was to lose the path back not to a place, but to a state of being? And what if these grooves, still etched in stone, still waiting in the dust, are not remnants of the past, but coordinates for a memory yet to awaken? Not far from the buried spiral grooves of Anatolia stands a chapel carved deep into the soft volcanic rock of Cappadocia. Locals call it the Blind Church, though no records ever explain the name. Its entrance is hidden behind a crumbled outcrop, accessible only through a narrow fissure that forces visitors to bow low and twist their bodies sideways. Inside, there are no windows, no paintings, no iconography at all. Just raw stone, smooth walls, and a curious silence that seems to press against the skin rather than the ear. Those who have stepped inside often speak not of what they saw, but of what they didn't, how their breath felt thicker, how time seemed to stretch, how even a whisper refused to rise. The geometry of the space is precise. Its dimensions follow a ratio not common in Christian architecture, but one found in ancient resonant chambers from Malta and Crete. A domed ceiling curves inwards, not upwards, forming a pressure point just above the heart when standing in the room's center. This spot, when struck with the softest tone, a hum, a breath, even the creak of a shoe amplifies back through the room in layers. Not an echo, but a rephrasing. A sound sent out, and returned slightly altered, as though filtered through memory. Acoustic engineers visiting the site in 2009 conducted a low-impact scan of its resonance field. Their results, never published formally, showed standing wave patterns forming a spiral around the central chamber, concentrated at harmonic intervals that did not match the shape of the stone. Something else shaped the sound. Something not present in the material, but embedded in the design. One engineer wrote, "It's as if the chapel was tuned to remember a frequency no longer spoken." Why would a Christian chapel in central Turkey carry such architectural fingerprints? The Blind Church is not alone. Across Cappadocia, in valleys rarely visited by tourists, are dozens of underground sanctuaries cut not as shelters, but as spaces of intentional silence. Some go 6 levels deep, with ventilation shafts angled not for air, but for tone. Certain corridors amplify the lowest vocal range, while others suppress the highest. In one chamber, a researcher noted that a spoken vowel, if sustained, created a resonance that induced nausea, then euphoria, then stillness. The sensation passed the moment they stepped out of alignment. These places were never fortified. They contain no defense walls, no water storage, no graves. They are not monastic in function, nor military in structure, and yet they were carved with obsessive care. Narrow halls expand into perfect spheres. Niches are cut at precise intervals. Floors slope at exact degrees. The repetition suggests purpose. The silence suggests secrecy. On the wall of one chamber, barely visible beneath soot and dust, a symbol reappears, the inward spiral carved not with chisel, but with heat. The stone around it is vitrified, hardened as though flash melted. No tool marks remain, only the groove, smooth to the touch, curving inward like a breath drawn through rock. What was its function? Some have proposed these chambers served as memory theaters not for stories or rituals, but for tuning human awareness. A process not unlike meditation, but architectural. The body enters, the sound aligns, and something inside remembers, not intellectually, but sonically, like a bell being rung back into its own tone. This theory may sound absurd until one compares it with older traditions. In Tibet, sacred caves were used not just for retreat, but for recalibration. The chanting of syllables within precise cavities produced altered states of awareness, described as waking while still. The resonance was not passive. It acted upon the body. And in some texts, it is said that the cave itself taught the initiate not with words, but with tone. The blind church fits this pattern, not by faith, but by function. A manuscript fragment found in a nearby monastery references a house without image, where voice returns as truth. It warns not to enter with deceit, not because of punishment, but because the stone will not repeat what is false. A metaphor, perhaps, or an instruction. In 2017, a team using ground-penetrating radar identified a larger complex beneath the known site. It extends horizontally, not vertically, following a curvature that aligns with magnetic anomalies previously undocumented. Beneath the deepest point lies a chamber shaped like a cochlea, a spiral, not metaphorical, but anatomical, as if the entire space was an ear. No excavation was permitted. The site was declared unstable, but the imaging remains clear, irrefutable. Someone carved a memory chamber in the shape of listening. And perhaps that was the point. Not to speak to gods, not to receive doctrine, but to listen until memory returned not as narrative, but as frequency. What if the blind church is not blind at all? What if it sees through silence? What if its spirals and shafts and impossible acoustics were not anomalies, but instructions? What if the ones who carved it were not hiding but waiting for someone who could finally hear? Long before words were carved into stone, long before alphabets fixed thought into shape, there were patterns, lines scratched into clay, curves etched into bone, grooves spiraling across walls with no apparent end. These grooves appear not only in temples or tombs, but in the most overlooked of places' thresholds, corners, forgotten corridors. Some are no longer visible except under raking light. Others still catch dust and whisper their geometry in silence. In temple after temple, from Delphi to Teotihuacan, these patterns recur. They do not form letters. They do not narrate. They spiral, split, return. Always the same rhythm, as if the builders remembered something modern minds cannot name. The earliest examples appear in caves, in France, at Jouvet and Lascaux. Long before painted animals adorned the walls, lines were drawn, not images, but curves. Etched into the stone with tools softer than bone, they served no decorative function. When scanned with infrared, some of these grooves align with acoustic hotspots, locations where sound lingers unnaturally long, not echoes, nodes, points where a footstep becomes a drumbeat, where breath becomes chord. These are not accidents. They are invitations. In southern Spain, the cave of Nerja contains similar grooves, narrow trenches spiraling across the walls just above shoulder height. When one of the researchers testing sound propagation inside the chamber hummed a low note, the walls responded, each spiral carrying the tone in a slow ripple. It was as if the space itself remembered how to vibrate, a resonance that had slept for millennia, awakened by chance. Why would people who had not yet invented writing carve sound paths into stone? Some believe these grooves were early tools for aligning awareness, used in rites we no longer understand. Others suggest they were mnemonic anchoring memory not to symbol, but to movement and tone. In cultures where language was not yet fixed, memory relied on rhythm, on breath, on place. Grooves, then, were not marks of record. They were paths of return. In Polynesia, ancient wayfinders navigated not by stars alone, but by wave patterns. Their canoes moved with the sea's pulse, their bodies trained to feel variations invisible to the eye. They carried no maps, no compasses, yet they crossed oceans. Their memory was spatial, embodied, passed from hand to hand. The rhythm of the waves was learned like a song, and that song was stored not in ink, but in movement. What if temple grooves were something similar stone-bound melodies for re-entering a state, a memory, a place no longer on the map? In Abydos, carved deep into the floor of the Osirian, a set of parallel grooves form an interlocking spiral. They terminate not at an altar, but beneath a submerged stone block no longer accessible. Divers exploring the area reported feelings of vertigo, even disassociation, as if something beneath the water pulled at their sense of direction. The grooves themselves are worn, smoothed by time and touch, but their spacing remains precise, measured not in inches, but in intervals that correspond to whole number ratios used in ancient musical scales. Harmony, etched in silence. One researcher compared the spacing to the tone ladder of the Chinese guqin. Another noted that the grooves mirrored the placement of pressure points along the spine in Ayurvedic medicine. Yet another saw the shape of theta wave patterns recorded in meditative brain states. These similarities are not proof, but they are not easily dismissed. They suggest a forgotten form of mapping, one that links body, sound, and space through form, rather than language. In the Andes, spiral grooves appear in stone staircases that lead nowhere, steps worn down by centuries of ritual movement, their destination unclear. Locals say the steps are not for climbing, they are for returning, a concept that makes no sense until one listens closely. For when wind moves through the corridor at dawn, the grooves hum, barely, softly, a tone that flickers and vanishes, but always in the same rhythm, a sound that waits for alignment. Perhaps these grooves are not ruins. Perhaps they are instruments whose songs have simply gone out of phase. In 1972, a team mapping archaeoacoustic sites in northern Italy discovered a small cave with spirals cut into the wall above a natural spring. When they chanted in unison, the spirals amplified the tone. sending it across the chamber in a way that bypassed normal echo. The sound reappeared behind them, not ahead. When they changed pitch, the direction shifted. It was not a reflection. It was a redirection. One of the researchers called it memory turned back upon itself. A monk visiting the site later remarked that the spiral grooves reminded him of the satyr square, an ancient Latin palindrome thought to contain hidden codes. Not for words, but for movement. He suggested that perhaps the spiral was not just a shape, but a syntax, a grammar of resonance. What if memory was once understood not as information, but as alignment? What if knowing meant syncing one's breath, one's body, to the shape of a space? And what if the grooves in temple stone are not remnants of a past culture, but reminders from one that remembered how to listen through form? Strange, then, that no one reported seeing flames. Not a single eyewitness described pillars of smoke rising from the Serapeum. No ash settled on the rooftops. No burnt parchment blew through the streets. And yet, the legend of a great fire persists, untouched by contradiction, unbothered by evidence. Chroniclers repeated the tale with increasing certainty as time went on, though their words echoed more myth than memory. They did not quote witnesses. They quoted each other. In the earliest accounts, the Serapeum's destruction is mentioned not as a conflagration, but as an event of removal. The Greek term apheresis is used a word that does not mean burning, but extraction. The Latin counterpart is even clearer, subductio, a drawing down, a lowering out of sight. One letter, penned by a Roman official stationed in Egypt, refers only to the lifting of the veil and the quiet clearing of the chamber. No mention of heat, only stillness. And yet, artists centuries later painted the temple engulfed in crimson tongues of fire, statues melting under supernatural light, scholars fleeing with scrolls clutched to their chests. These images are dramatic, memorable, and completely unsupported. But they persist because the story of a burning is easier to digest than the story of a disappearance. The Serapeum, unlike the Great Library, was not merely a storehouse. It was a map in stone, a spatial diagram of harmonics, proportion, and celestial resonance. The massive underground chambers beneath the temple once held granite sarcophagi weighing over 70 tons each. Too large to be coffins, too smooth to be accidents, they were positioned with uncanny precision. Some aligned with solstice light shafts. Others responded to low-frequency tones with vibrations that could be felt through the feet. One archaeologist, in a private notebook never published, recorded an incident while working in the lowest corridor. When he stood between two of the granite boxes and hummed a low note, the air between them shimmered. His voice wavered. The tone fed back into itself. He described the moment as not sound, but memory made audible. The next day, that corridor was sealed. The box was removed. No explanation followed. Why remove something that does not burn? Why erase what cannot ignite? Perhaps because fire is final. It erases without question. But what if the goal was not erasure, but containment? In a sealed archive beneath the Vatican, rarely opened and never discussed publicly, exists a codex known to a few as Fragmentum Harmonicum, said to be copied from earlier Egyptian sources. It describes a house of stone where the word remains unspoken, yet moves through men as light through glass. Scholars who have seen the codex describe diagrams resembling the Serapeum's layout. Each chamber is marked not with a number, but with a pitch. Each sarcophagus is paired with a frequency. The implication is clear. The structure was not a tomb, it was an instrument. And if it was an instrument, then its silence posed a threat. What would it mean if memory could be reawakened not by study, but by tone? If history were not something read, but something remembered bodily, involuntarily, upon standing in the right place, under the right resonance? There are stories, too fragmented to cite, but too persistent to ignore, of individuals who entered the lowest chambers and emerged disoriented, speaking languages no longer known. Others reportedly heard choirs in the stone, patterns of sound that made no sense but echoed for days afterward in dreams. Whether legend or not, such accounts were enough to frighten those who believed knowledge should move only through script, hierarchy, and control. Better to burn a building than allow it to remember by itself. And yet, not everything was taken. One of the granite boxes remains, hidden behind a museum wall in Saqqara, mislabeled as a sarcophagus of unknown origin, its surface polished to a near mirror. When tapped gently, it hums not loudly, but low, a frequency felt more than heard. No markings, no carvings, just form, just tone. Visitors report a strange sense of time dilation when near it. One described the feeling of falling inward, though they had not moved. Another spoke of hearing their own heartbeat slow to match the rhythm of the stone. A researcher, privately, said only, "It knew me." Perhaps what was removed from the Serapeum was not knowledge in the conventional sense, but the capacity for knowing. The architecture itself may have served as a bridge not metaphorical, but acoustic, a structure that enabled the resynchronization of memory through resonance. And, once removed, that bridge could not be redrawn on paper. It could only be rebuilt, or forgotten. So the story of fire spread. It was clean, theatrical, irreversible. No one would search for what had already burned. No one would ask what cannot be translated. But a memory encoded in stone cannot be so easily erased. It waits, not in words, but in structure. It waits beneath museums, beneath rebuilt foundations, beneath centuries of silence. And what if it still waits? What if the last echoes of the Serapeum did not vanish into flame, but were buried alive, sealed not to destroy, but to prevent something from returning? Carved into rose-red stone and veiled by desert silence, the city of Petra rises not from the earth, but from memory. Its facades, cut with reverence into canyon walls, suggest not dwelling but ceremony columns too tall for shelter, thresholds too narrow for procession, altars shaped more like instruments than platforms. The city breathes precision, but it is the voids that speak loudest. Chambers left incomplete, corridors that narrow into nothing, stairs leading upward into solid rock. These are not ruins from age. They were made that way, left unfinished not from abandonment, but by design. At the heart of the city stands the monastery ad-Dir, its entrance framed by pillars that hold no roof, its interior absent of altar or idol. When archaeologists first explored its inner chamber, they expected dust, debris, signs of collapse. Instead, they found smooth stone, curved walls, a central cavity in the floor, and above it, a circular aperture that does not align with the sun or moon, but with a stellar coordinate that precessed out of alignment more than 2,000 years ago. In other words, the light that once passed through this space no longer does. The earth has turned. The signal is gone. Yet the structure remains attuned. When a sound is made in that chamber, a soft chant, a hum, the resonance lasts longer than it should. Not as echo, but as presence. The stone does not reflect. It holds. It continues. Some frequencies vanish completely. Others amplify beyond their source. A physicist visiting in 2003 noted that the room responds like a chamber tuned to a missing note. The aperture above is not just architectural, it is harmonic. A forgotten alignment between light, space, and sound. Other chambers in Petra share this quality. The urn tomb, for example, has acoustics so precise that a single voice, centered, becomes omnidirectional. Priests, it is believed, could speak to hundreds with no amplification. But what if that was not the point? What if the chambers were not built to broadcast but to align the Nabateans, who built Petra, left few texts, but fragments suggest they understood the sky as structure, not story. Their monuments do not merely face celestial events, they echo them. The angles of shadow, the points of silence, the flows of sound all seem chosen not for human ritual, but for resonance with something larger. A Greek traveler, writing in the 1st century CE, described Petra not as a city, but as a place where the stones remember. He claimed that locals brought no instruments into the high chambers. They sang with the rocks, and the rocks responded. No one believed him, but the echoes remain. In a smaller chamber known as the Broken Mouth, archaeologists found a sequence of shallow grooves spiraling into the floor beneath a now-missing obelisk. These grooves match in proportion those found in the Maltese hypogeum. When water was poured into the spiral, it did not pool. It vibrated ripples forming a standing wave at the center. A stone placed there would tremble softly. The chamber had no visible purpose, but the air within feels heavy, as if shaped to contain something no longer present. Later studies revealed that Petra's location is not arbitrary. It sits along a fault line where magnetic anomalies fluctuate with solar cycles. These fluctuations influence sound propagation. In certain years, the city hums, not continuously, but intermittently. Local Bedouins speak of nights when the rocks sing, when the canyon walls vibrate with tones no human makes. Most dismiss it as wind, but those who have heard it say it is deeper, measured, intentional. If true, Petra may be more than a city. It may be a harmonic device, a vast stone instrument designed not for music, but for memory. And the unfinished corridors, the blind staircases, the unreachable ledges, they may not be architectural failures. They may be acoustic dampeners, filters, chambers left open to preserve silence, not due to collapse, but because silence was part of the mechanism. Some believe Petra was a tuning site used to align human consciousness with celestial rhythm, not permanently, but cyclically. A place activated during certain alignments, then closed. Its silence not abandonment, but completion. Like a bell rung once and then set aside. This theory gained traction after a study in 2018 mapped acoustic interference patterns across the site. Certain chambers, when activated with low-frequency tone generators, produced phase cancellations that mimicked EEG patterns of theta states. Not accidentally. Repeatedly. The implication is disturbing, that the builders understood brainwave synchronization through space alone, that the monuments were not for the eye, but for the mind. And if Petra was such a place, then what were they trying to remember? One inscription, carved in the smallest chamber near the ridge of Jebel al-Mathba, simply reads, "The note returns when the circle breaks." No context, no known reference, but it echoes the design of Petra itself, a city of broken circles, incomplete forms, voids where function should be, as if each absence were a promise, a resonance deferred. What if the city was never meant to last? What if its perfection required erosion, its chambers tuned not to the present, but to a future moment when the wind would strike just right, and the memory sealed in stone would sing again. Far below the island of Malta, beneath layers of limestone and ordinary time, lies the hypogum of Hal Saflieni, a subterranean structure whose very silence unsettles. Cut 3 stories deep into rock with no known tools, the hypogum is unlike any other ancient space. It is not a tomb, though bones were found there. It is not a temple, though its chambers are shaped like the inside of a body. It is, by all functional definitions, a resonance engine, a place where sound does not simply travel, but transforms. The oracle room, a small oval chamber on the middle level, is where the transformation begins. Its dimensions are uneven, asymmetrical, curved like a throat. When a human voice, especially a male voice, chants a sustained note between 95 and 120 hertz, the walls come alive. The sound intensifies, folds into itself, and spreads throughout the structure. In adjacent chambers, listeners feel the vibration in their bones. Not a metaphor. An actual vibration, as if the air itself has thickened, drawn into the breath of stone. Acoustic testing has confirmed this effect. Researchers using digital analyzers mapped the standing waves and discovered patterns too precise to be accidental. The room acts as a frequency filter, amplifying certain tones while canceling others. It was, quite literally, tuned. And yet, it predates written Maltese history. No blueprints, no mythic attribution, only presence, and a silence that feels older than language. But the resonance doesn't stop in the oracle room. It moves. Sound introduced there propagates downward through vertical shafts that connect to deeper chambers, spiraling through corridors carved with curves not for ease, but for echo. Some of these chambers respond to sound by producing harmonic overtones, tones not present in the original voice, as if the space itself is singing back, as if the stone has memory. In one chamber, known only by its excavation code, a rhythmic beat was detected in the walls, one that persisted even when no sound was introduced. Geologists attributed it to underground water flow, but hydrologists disagreed. There is no water beneath the hypogum. The rhythm remains unaccounted for. A pulse without a source, a drum without a hand. What kind of structure behaves like this? Some suggest the hypogum was a place of sensory initiation, that its chambers were designed to disorient, then align, not with doctrine, but with frequency. The visitor would descend, step by step, into increasing resonance, until the line between inner and outer sound dissolved. What remained was presence. Not knowledge as content, but knowledge as coherence. Archaeologists found no idols, no inscriptions, no directional markers, only form, only proportion. The spiral motif, etched into stone, appears again and again not as art, but as architecture. It dictates the path. It guides the tone. It shapes the echo. The body moves through it not with decision, but with instinct, and the spiral is not random. Its measurements correspond to the golden ratio. Its curvature matches that of certain cochlear models in mammalian ears. One acoustic engineer referred to the hypogum as a stone ear, listening to itself. The implications are unsettling. That the entire structure may have been designed to hear. Not just sounds from within, but vibrations from below, from above, from something forgotten. An 18th century report by a Jesuit antiquarian mentions an artifact found near the entrance now lost, described as a staff of red stone, capped with iron, warm to the hand, humming faintly when held against the wall. No drawing survives. Only that line, yet it echoes descriptions found in Egyptian texts of resonance rods, and in Sumerian reliefs of rods held to the lips. Perhaps the hypogeum was part of a larger network sites across the ancient world built not for visibility, but for audition. Listening posts for memory stored in tone. In recent decades, modern researchers have attempted to build replicas of the oracle room to test its effect on human cognition. Subjects exposed to sustained chanting within the chamber display changes in brainwave patterns specifically. An increase in theta waves associated with deep meditation and memory recall. Some report vivid imagery. Others enter states of temporal distortion. The room does not merely amplify sound. It alters perception. But the real question is why? Why build such a space? Why carve 3 levels into rock just to chase a resonance? The answer may lie in how ancient cultures understood memory not as data, but as rhythm. The past was not stored in documents. It was carried in tone. In order to remember, one did not read, one listened. What if the hypogeum was not a sanctuary, but a tuner? A place where human awareness was recalibrated to match the Earth's deeper pulse, a place to access memory not of personal events, but of species, of place, of cosmos. The spiral, the hum, the silence, it all suggests alignment, not metaphorical, but acoustic. And when that alignment was achieved, perhaps memory emerged, whole, wordless, true. What if the hypogeum was a doorway not to another world, but to the forgotten harmony of this one? The statues in ancient temples were never meant to be seen as still. Though carved in stone, they carried posture, tension, poise as if waiting for something that never arrived. Yet in certain sites across the Mediterranean, these figures were said to move, not in motion, but in voice. They echoed, they sang, and then they fell silent, not because belief faded, but because someone silenced them. The Colossi of Memnon, 2 seated figures guarding the west bank of the Nile, were once famous not for their size, but for their sound. At dawn, travelers from across the empire gathered to hear a faint, flute-like tone rising from the northern statue. The Greeks called it a miracle. The Romans documented it. The sound came not every day, but under specific conditions when temperature, wind, and sunlight converged. The explanation, they claimed, was thermal expansion, but the ancients said otherwise. They believed the statue was calling. More curious still was the fact that after repairs were made by Roman engineers in the 3rd century, the sound ceased permanently, as if the stone, once mended, had nothing more to say. The phenomenon was not unique. In the Serapeum of Alexandria, eyewitnesses described seated statues whose mouths would hum when the chamber resonated. These were not idols with hollow cores. They were massive, dense, and yet they responded to sound as if built for it. One traveler from Byzantium wrote of a statue that whispered not in language, but in rhythm when a certain tone was sung nearby. Elsewhere, in the Temple of Delphi, the omphalos stone thought to mark the navel of the world was once reported to buzz softly during rituals. The tone, priests claimed, was the earth itself speaking. Modern archaeologists dismiss such tales as symbolic, but the acoustics of these temples tell another story. In 2006, a team of researchers studying resonance in Greek sanctuaries found that many key structures shared unusual audio properties. Inner sanctums, often dome-shaped or vaulted, produced standing waves between 110 and 140 hertz. That is, when certain frequencies were sung or struck, the room itself would sing back. In some cases, the human voice would appear amplified, not echoing, but reinforced. The effect was not mystical, it was architectural. And in that architecture, a pattern emerged. Temples that housed oracles or statues of divine figures consistently aligned with not just the cardinal directions, but with acoustically potent landscape features: cliffs, caverns, water channels. Their builders were not simply placing structures for visibility or ritual, they were tuning them. A fragment of a Babylonian clay tablet, partially translated, speaks of a statue that hears and replies without breath. No context is given. But another passage on the same tablet describes a voice drawn from the hollows of the god's chest. Scholars treat this as poetic metaphor. Yet similar descriptions appear in Egyptian, Greek, and even early Christian texts. What if these statues were not representations, but instruments? Several examples of ancient statuary exhibit internal chambers, unexplained cavities, or pipe-like conduits running from base to torso. Not all are connected to any visible external source. Some have acoustic openings too small for airflow, but large enough to carry resonance. Engineers have proposed that sound could be directed through the floor, activating the figure from below. In a museum in Istanbul, a headless basalt figure sits largely unnoticed. Catalogued as Hittite, its chest bears a peculiar cavity, smoothly carved, with no clear purpose. When a flute was accidentally played nearby during a children's demonstration, the cavity emitted a low, harmonic tone. The guide called it coincidence. But a researcher returned later, played a single note, and recorded a response. Not music, but interference. The stone had vibrated, not echoing the sound, but reshaping it. It was not alone. Across Anatolia, temple fragments with concave surfaces show signs of tuning. Tiny holes, regular spacing, harmonic scaling etched not by erosion, but by design. They were not just places to speak. They were places to be spoken through. What if the role of the statue was never to represent the divine, but to channel it? And more unsettling, what if the silence that followed was not decay, but suppression? After the rise of centralized orthodoxy in the early centuries of the Common Era, descriptions of talking statues disappear rapidly from texts. Pilgrimages to resonant temples were replaced by rigid liturgies. Acoustic spaces were sealed. Statues with cavities were destroyed or buried. The tone became taboo. One bishop in the 5th century wrote that the stone tongue of false gods must be shattered, lest it speak again. Another directive, found in a council decree, ordered the dismantling of idols which murmur in the night. Officially, such language was symbolic. But the consistency is odd. Why fear that which cannot speak? Unless, of course, it once did. And if so, what did it say? It begins not with what is present, but with what is absent, a silence in stone, an erasure too consistent to be chance. Across ancient temples in India, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mesoamerica, spiral patterns appear in carvings, floors, pillars, and ritual basins, sometimes shallow, sometimes carved deep, always precise, spirals that spin inward, not outward, spirals that guide the eye not to movement, but to stillness. And yet, few scholars agree on their meaning. Most call them decorative, others call them solar, but none explain why the same spiral appears beneath altars, within sanctums, and on the skin of deities who are themselves forgotten. In the temple of Chavin de Huantar, high in the Peruvian Andes, a series of channels run beneath the floor, winding in spiral curves that defy practical plumbing. No water runs through them now, yet when wind moves through the temple's broken edges, it enters those channels and emerges as low, animal-like tones, like growls filtered through hollow stone. Archaeologists once believed these to be drainage systems, until recordings captured the acoustics in 1998. The sounds did not flow randomly. They modulated, varied with pressure, echoed in rhythmic patterns. One of the researchers noted that the chambers had the same effect on the inner ear as infrasound. Not pain, not pressure, but unease, vertigo, as if the body recognized something that the mind could not name. That same year, a team in Malta returned to the hypogeum and discovered a pattern etched faintly into the central chamber, barely visible unless the light hit at an angle. A spiral, no larger than a human hand, nested in another spiral, slightly off-center. When the room was activated with a low frequency, the carving began to shimmer not physically, but perceptually. A trick of vibration, where stone appears to shift as the eye seeks anchoring lines. In India, the Konark Sun Temple contains similar motifs. Spirals carved into the backs of horses, the rims of wheels, the naves of ceilings always in shadowed corners, rarely centered. In the dark, their presence seems incidental, but when sunlight filters in through narrow slits during solstice alignment, it catches the grooves and sets them glowing. As if reminding those below that what turns in light must first be carved in dark, the pattern is persistent. In the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, a now-sealed crypt once contained what modern guides call the Dendera light, a motif that resembles a coiled tube emitting rays. Most dismiss it as stylized lotus or symbolic of life. But the walls around it bear spiral notches, small and clustered, carved into the borders of pillars. And the chamber itself resonates at 111 Hz, an acoustic frequency shown to trigger temporal dislocation in auditory processing tests. What was the spiral? For some propose it is a map, a visual encoding of resonance paths. That the spiral, in its asymmetrical inward draw, reflects not the sun, but sound. A way to guide tone through space, to harness echo not as reflection, but as memory loop. One physicist suggested the spirals operate like passive sonic traps. That, within their curvature, a note lingers longer, held in microvortices of air pressure. Ancient walls would not echo outward, but spiral inward, folding tone back into itself until it faded. Not into silence, but into the listener. At Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple on Earth, circular enclosures marked by T-shaped pillars stand like tuning forks for a forgotten choir. Some of the stones show faint spiral marks, worn almost to invisibility. Too weathered to date, too deliberate to dismiss. And near one such spiral, a cavity opens into a tunnel, leading nowhere. Yet sound introduced there produces an echo that does not repeat, but slows like a record winding down. None of these sites are connected in doctrine or language. Their gods differ. Their myths diverge. Yet the spiral persists, a symbol of turning inward, a path with no center, or perhaps a doorway drawn from tone, not stone. What if these grooves were not symbols at all? What if they were storage? If resonance is a carrier of memory, if frequency embeds thought in form, then a spiral, cut into stone, could hold not just symbol, but signal, not to be read, but to be played. And maybe the silence now is not from loss. Maybe it is from ignorance of the note that unlocks it. The library of Pergamon was once considered second only to Alexandria. Built into the hillside of what is now Bergama, Turkey, it was said to house over 200,000 scrolls texts carved in ink, but also in pattern. What few mention are the stones outside the main repository. not part of the grand structure, but scattered around it unmarked, dark, untouched by inscription. At first glance, they appear as construction remnants, debris from transport or quarry. Yet one of these, referred to in 19th century notes as the soundless stone, resists all classification. It is basalt, polished unevenly, with a single shallow concavity on its surface. It holds no symbol, no joint, no tool mark, but when struck, even lightly, it produces nothing. No note, no ring. It is dead to sound, not muffled, but void. Acoustic engineers in the 1970s tested its density, expecting air pockets or internal flaws. They found none. It absorbed vibration completely, an object of pure silence. This puzzled them more than if it had sung. Most stones produce some form of echo, even in small frequencies. Resonance finds paths, but the soundless stone gave nothing back. It behaved not like an object, but like a hole in frequency. And in the records of the Pergamon priests kept hidden from public inscriptions, a line appears, etched in a minor script. The stone that cannot be heard guards what cannot be spoken. The phrase was not repeated, but the stone remained, placed at the eastern flank of the site, precisely aligned with the rising sun at equinox. Across from it, embedded into the retaining wall of a terrace now partially collapsed, lies another anomaly, 3 grooves, triangular, spaced evenly and pointing downward. Engineers could not determine their function. But when a low tone was projected between the grooves and the soundless stone, instruments detected a sudden drop in ambient frequency, not noise, absence, a vacuum in the spectrum. Something was removed from the field, not filtered, erased. The team recorded the session. Playback revealed a 3-second stretch of corrupted audio, complete silence, as if the microphone itself had ceased to exist. Other devices, running parallel but off-site, showed no interruption. Only the area between the stone and the grooves was affected. Such zones are rare. Acoustic nulls can occur in controlled environments, but here, in an open-air ruin carved into bedrock, the occurrence is impossible to replicate by accident. The orientation, the angle, the distance it suggests intent. Further investigation found nothing more, but that wasn't entirely true. A local worker, unnamed in the official records, claimed that during excavation of a side stairway in 1963, he unearthed a small tablet, unlike the others made not of clay, but of lead. Thin, brittle, inscribed in a language he could not identify. When exposed to sunlight, he said, the tablet grew warm. When placed near the soundless stone, it trembled, not visibly, but to the touch. He turned it over to a government official. No record of its analysis exists, but the story remains. Quiet, circulating in footnotes and whispered among those who study resonance. Could the soundless stone have been more than an anomaly? Could it have been a kind of lock in digital systems? Silence is often a break, a failure of transmission. But in older codes, especially analog ones, silence can be data. A pause of precise duration can carry as much meaning as a note. In Morse, in rhythm, in sonar, silence is never empty. It is a carrier. So what happens when a place is designed not to produce silence, but to be it? A stone that ends vibration is not passive. It is active. It is subtraction embodied. It holds not message, but the absence of message and erasure embedded into matter. And that raises another question. If the soundless stone erases vibration, what else does it erase? Some believe it may have functioned as a seal not of doors, but of memory. that, when placed in precise alignment with echo-producing structures, it disrupted the harmonic feedback loop necessary to retain acoustic memory. In simpler terms, if memory was stored in vibration, the stone deleted the playback. And once gone, the silence remained. A silence too precise to be natural, too positioned to be accidental, too complete to be anything but design. In 1972, while conducting sonar sweeps near the Bay of Abu Qir, a team of underwater surveyors searching for colonial-era shipwrecks detected a pattern that did not belong. What emerged from the silt was not debris nor rockfall, but a deliberate alignment pillars buried beneath layers of coral, carved with shallow grooves that did not match any known Egyptian script. At first, they assumed Roman ballast or Ptolemaic dock ruins, but the measurements defied expectations. Each column was spaced precisely 9 cubits apart, aligned not to the shoreline, but to the stars. Among the crew was an engineer trained in acoustic architecture. When he entered the water and moved between the pillars, he noticed something unusual. Certain frequencies emitted from his sonar bounced back with unnatural resonance, as if the columns were tuned. When plotted on a grid, the formation did not form a line, but a spiral, curving westward beneath the seabed, beyond the mapped zone. The spiral matched a recurring pattern in ancient schematics known only from the margins of forbidden texts, what some call the path of echo. The team filed their report, documenting the coordinates, submitting audio anomalies and underwater sketches. Within months, the record vanished from public archives. Only one photograph remains, a blurred image of 5 stone shafts arching out from the sand like ribs of a buried creature, caught in mid-turn. No academic institution has since acknowledged the site. Local divers speak of dangerous currents and equipment failure near the area. A few whisper about the tone, a low hum heard only when the water is still. Elsewhere, along the coast of Crete, divers exploring submerged Minoan outposts uncovered a chamber with 3 concentric walls, each bearing acoustic vents, slots shaped not for water flow, but for wave manipulation. The structure, now underwater for millennia, still produces tonal feedback when certain frequencies are introduced. A visiting musician, experimenting with a waterproof tuning fork, documented a harmonic return precisely 4 beats after each strike. The delay was not natural, it was programmed. This timing matches a theory found in an obscure fragment of the Corpus Hermeticum, which mentions the 4-fold silence before truth is heard. Most dismiss it as metaphysical metaphor, but within that same text is a diagram one that depicts a spiral sea path, marked by 4 pulse points. The 4th is labeled phonon, the lost voice. Scholars ignored it. The sound engineers did not. The implication was disturbing. If ancient builders knew how to shape space to capture sound on land, perhaps they had also discovered how to embed resonance beneath the sea. And if sound was once used to retain memory, then these submerged structures may not be ruins, they may be archives, still active, still humming in the dark. The path of echo is not merely architectural. It may be geographic. A trail carved not into stone, but into the fabric of the earth itself. When satellite thermal imaging was later applied to the North African coast, subtle temperature anomalies traced a spiral shape off the Nile Delta. Extending toward the submerged plateau where Heracleion once stood, the anomalies were not dramatic fractions of a degree but consistent, recurring each year in late September. During this window, divers report clearer currents, more vivid marine behavior, and in some cases, phantom tones heard through equipment not built to receive sound. The Egyptian authorities call it superstition, yet they no longer allow civilian access to the mapped spiral zone. A researcher from Marseille, using deep harmonic pulses from a remote submersible, claims to have triggered a minor tremor near the site in 1997. It was not seismic in nature. No tectonic movement registered. But 3 audio monitors, placed kilometers apart, recorded a perfect harmonic resonance at 47 Hz identical across distance and time. It lasted 7 seconds. Then the instruments crashed. When restored, the drives showed no corruption, no error. Only 7 seconds of perfect tone, then nothing. What kind of structure could produce such synchronization? And more urgently, who built it? The ancient texts speak of a city lost to the sea. But what if it was never lost? What if it was sealed, spiraled down beneath frequency thresholds, buried not under earth, but under resonance? A city that does not echo, but listens. It was always assumed that temples spoke through image and text, through gods carved in relief and stories etched in stone. But what if some spoke only in tone, and were never meant to be read? On the island of Delos, once considered the navel of the Aegean, lies a half-collapsed shrine with no altar, no idol, no dedicatory inscription, just walls curved inward, polished not with tools but, seemingly, time itself. Visitors often walk past it, mistaking it for a cistern. But if one stands precisely at the center and whispers, the sound returns not as echo, but as a mirrored voice slightly deeper, slightly delayed, as if another stood behind the wall and answered. No explanation has satisfied acousticians. The stone should reflect or scatter, not shift timbre, yet it shifts, not always, but only when the surrounding air is still. Some blame temperature gradients. Others suspect underground cavities, but a few have called it what it feels like a response. In 2004, a group of independent researchers tested the space with variable frequency pulses. Most yielded no response, but at 93 Hz, a distinct hum emerged from the upper quadrant of the dome, reverberating not from the pulse origin, but from the stone itself. It did not decay. It held steady for 12 seconds, then ceased instantly. It didn't fade. It stopped, like a breath withheld. In their notes, they marked the result as nonlinear response and moved on. But local folklore surrounding the shrine holds an older memory. It speaks of the answering stone, a place where oracles once went not to speak prophecy, but to receive it, alone, in silence, waiting for the reply that did not come from within. Elsewhere, in Cappadocia's underground churches, hidden beneath volcanic ash and bone-white tuff, certain narrow corridors appear to serve no practical purpose. They wind in loops, often ending in blind walls, but the sound within them lingers. If one sings a single note, it does not echo, it hovers, a tone stretched thin, like a thread pulled taut across air. These corridors, researchers discovered, resonate at exact integer multiples of 100 million Hz, the same frequency found in the Dendera crypt and the Hypogeum's oracle room. This recurrence cannot be chance. Too many sites. Too much precision. These were not random architectural accidents. They were tuned chambers, designed to catch and hold specific vibrations, not merely for ritual, for activation. One hypothesis posits that such frequencies induce altered states of consciousness disorientation, heightened intuition, temporal distortion. But ancient builders lacked our vocabulary for brainwaves or psychoacoustics. They didn't measure effect in EEGs. They felt it in their bones. So why tune so many rooms to this number? Perhaps because it was not a number, but a key. And keys do not function alone. Across ruins in Syria, In a site rarely mentioned outside of French military records, lies a carved basin with a spiral groove at its base. When water is poured in silence, nothing happens. But when poured while a tone is played at 111 Hz, the water ripples in hexagonal pattern symmetry where none existed. The patterns form briefly, hold, then collapse, as if the basin responds not to the substance, but to the sound. This behavior echoes accounts from the Temple of Menasdra in Malta, where some believe sacred libations were poured in rhythm to sung chants, not to please a god, but to open memory, to stabilize a field, to awaken stone. It raises a deeper question. What if these temples were not places of worship, but interfaces? What if stone, when tuned and aligned, becomes not structure, but sensor? Then the myths of talking statues, of oracles in trance, and gods speaking from walls may not be metaphor, they may be artifact. Echoes of a time when resonance was not a byproduct but a language. One we no longer understand because we forgot the note. Or worse, because someone made sure we forgot. They called it a ruin, a myth, a temple desecrated by time and conquest. But beneath the labels and charred stones, something else had always lingered, something no official record ever fully named. The Serapeum was not erased, it was silenced. Not because it failed to hold knowledge, but because it held too much of what knowledge had once been, not in books, but in form, not in facts, but in frequency. The echoes of that silence still pulse across centuries, encoded not in the words of chroniclers, but in architectural patterns, buried alignments, and scattered symbols left unclassified. In 1985, a sound engineer studying the acoustic properties of the hypogeum in Malta noted that one chamber shaped like a narrow oval produced harmonic overtones capable of inducing theta brainwave states. He was not the first to notice. In private letters dating to the 1930s, a Jesuit linguist wrote of hearing voices when standing within a similar chamber in Coptic ruins outside Cairo. Not hallucinations, he insisted. Echoes. Repetitions. Messages passed not by language, but by tone. If the Serapeum had once operated in the same way, then its destruction was not only architectural, but dimensional. Its silencing was the closing of a frequency gate, one that had once connected thought, place, and vibration. One that may still pulse beneath the foundations of modern Cairo, quiet but intact. Some say the chambers below remain sealed, filled not with relics, but with sound locked in stone, waiting. Others believe they were emptied deliberately, their function disabled through the removal of a single tuned element, perhaps a pillar, perhaps a capstone, something small, resonant, a harmonic keystone. In 2020, a sealed shaft beneath the modern Maspero building cracked during metro construction. Workers reported a sudden drop in temperature, followed by the sound of humming metal, though no machines were active. The shaft was resealed within hours. No photos released. No reports filed. Only a vague notice of structural instability and a redirect of transit plans. Official silence. The Vatican archives, according to a few declassified memos, hold references to the Serapeum not as temple, but as interface. That word appears only once, in a Latin marginalia scrawled beside a translation of Iamblichus. If the temple is an interface, then memory is not stored. It is accessed. The note was crossed out in red. No citation. No explanation. So perhaps what burned was not just a library, but a mechanism. And perhaps what was lost was not merely knowledge, but the ability to retrieve it. What if the deepest secret of Atlantis was not that it vanished, but that it remembered, not as myth or monument, but through a network of tuned places that sustained a harmonic field, one that allowed memory to be collective, spatial, and permanent. And what if the erasure of that field did not end in flame, but in silence? The spiral does not end. It narrows. It folds inward like breath withheld in a chamber too long sealed. The questions have not faded. They have only settled into dust, waiting for footsteps to stir them again. Perhaps no fire ever truly burned the records. Perhaps no scroll was ever needed. If memory once lived in stone, in sound, in the shape of silence itself, then forgetting was not a lapse. It was an act. Somewhere, beneath foundations we no longer question, lies a resonance older than language. A pulse not recorded, but embedded, coded into the geometry of pillars, the tilt of chambers, the alignment of light on equinox mornings. Every monument repurposed, every temple renamed, every myth laughed into metaphor, each one a cut thread, a signal lost mid-transmission, but the trace remains. It lingers in empty rooms that sing to no one, in statues whose eyes do not reflect light, but swallow it, in corridors that narrow not to trap the body, but to focus the voice. The ancients did not decorate, they tuned. And what they tuned was not merely sacred space, but memory itself. Not a past written in ink, but a present stretched backward alive, reachable, if only the right frequency were struck again. So if something in you still stirs at the sound of wind in stone places, or the feel of echo beneath your feet, perhaps it is not imagination. Perhaps it is reception. Perhaps memory is not something lost, only something waiting to be heard again.